Hi, I'm Donovan, and I'm continuing on with Sacrament. This is chapter 5. We're in the second part of chapter 5, and it's called Introduction to Prayer of Deep Loving Union. We're on that fourth kind of prayer. I've been sharing about prayer in this first part of the book. Um, Part 1 is really sort of about ways of connecting with God through the mind and through words, and part 2 is going to be about connecting to God with body and flesh and senses. But anyway, so we're closing in on toward the end of part 1, and it's this last kind of prayer we're going to talk about, which is mystical union. So reaching a state of blissful mystical oneness with all that is may be a familiar goal of meditation and devotion in many traditions. Those who are Christians, though, might be a little bit skeptical that this can also be part of their practice. John of the Cross, another survivor of the Spanish Inquisition in 16th century Spain. I've talked a lot about Teresa of Avila, who's as the main survivor of the Spanish Inquisition that I've been talking about how she prayed. John of the Cross is her student, and he's really one of the primary authorities on this deeper contemplative state of deep loving union, prayer of union, higher contemplation, um, in the Christian tradition. He's pretty much one of the main authorities, if not the authority on it. His famous poem about this mystical experience, a lot of people have heard of. It's called Dark Night of the Soul. So you may not know the poem, you may not know it was John of the Cross or Juan de la Cruz that wrote it, but Dark Night of the Soul has become a very common phrase in English, at least, for talking about those sort of spiritual crises type of times that can be kind of a rite of passage in which faith might deepen. Um, so anyway, same guy. He's the one that's written the most about this in the Christian tradition. And that Dark Night of the Soul poem is inspired by the Song of Songs in the Bible. Which, again, if you don't know a lot about the Bible, you might have heard of the Song of Songs as sort of, some people think it's the most erotic of all the biblical books. It's in Hebrew scriptures, it's part of the wisdom literature. Some people interpret it as the mystical marriage of the lover of God with God. Some people believe it's just a beautiful, joyous celebration of the kind of intimacy that human beings can experience with one another, and that it doesn't have to be a metaphor for God, that it can be just a standalone, in a sense, not standalone, but it can stand as a celebration of human intimacy as a gift from God. So anyway, the Song of Songs, it seems to be an example, or it seems to be the inspiration for this dark night of the soul, along with his own lived experience in prayer. And it presents the Christian as a lover who's passionately longing for, seeking divine union with Christ. So again, the reason I'm bringing this up is just to say that if you happen to be coming from the Christian tradition and you're feeling like this might be a little uncomfortable for me to just explore mystical union with God, oh, that sounds a little bit too much like yoga or Buddhism, or many of my friends who might watch this are practitioners of yoga or Buddhism, so that won't be a problem for us. But of course, if someone's feeling uncomfortable, just want to invite you in to explore this through your own tradition, and just to know that that can be, you have an entry point that belongs to your own path that you might feel more comfortable with. To reach this union with God, we stop relying on our own understanding, and we stop relying on our own experience, our own feelings, our own imagination. We don't look to those things that come from within us as our only resource. God transcends all those things. Another way of looking at it is, God created our understanding, our experience, our feeling, our imagination. So of course, God is greater than those things. Instead of relying on our own words, thoughts, these things we've been doing in the other kinds of prayer we have tried, we drop all our efforts, All our pretenses and defenses, we drop those and we allow ourselves to become completely empty and naked before God. John of the Cross said, the intellect must be perfected in the darkness of faith, the memory in the emptiness of hope, and the will in the nakedness and absence of every affection. So again, for John of the Cross, it was those dark nights of the soul when we're feeling the most bereft, when we kind of feel lost of our own capacities. A lot of us might be feeling this way right now in the pandemic, in the economic downturn, in the systemic injustices that are coming to light in our. It's not like they're unknown to many of us, but at the same time, they're how can I say, the intensity and the visibility of these injustices is increasing. So the feelings of sorrow, grief, rage, that dark night of the soul, it might be something that's a lot of us are experiencing right now. And this is a time when we're ripe for mystical union, to experience where we're starting to feel empty. That fullness with God can come in sometimes for people. So again, this is one of the reasons I'm trying to share this now. This is something I was writing quite a few years ago, but I'm very grateful to revisit it. And I've been in lockdown for 6 months now myself, and it's giving me some comfort to turn back to these teachings, and I share them just to be a little less alone with them. It's great to pray alone, but it's even better to pray with friends. So I hope somehow this is a way to do that. So since this kind of prayer is so exceptionally, exquisitely intimate, that being filled with God when you're completely empty, in periods of colonial violence, institutional religious authorities like the Spanish inquisitors required many tests of those who claimed to experience it. So that's one reason Teresa of Avila and especially John of the Cross were in a lot of trouble. In fact, he wrote Dark Night of the Soul when he was in prison. And, they were tried as heretics for having these intimate, mystical, beautiful experiences with God. They were tried by their own religion, people of their own faith. So I'm just sharing that now, not because it's relevant. People are still experiencing colonial violence and oppression by institutional religious leaders. So these are the prayers of the people who survived that, and that's why I'm sharing it, I guess. The point is, religious authorities have always tested, not always, excuse me, in times like these, religious authorities have cracked down on people that are having really rich mystical experiences as individuals. Even when they were trying to operate within their own religious communities, the religious leaders of their own communities were cracking down, right, and trying to exclude them. So, which is an experience some of us might be very familiar with. My question is it as necessary to micromanage someone else's spiritual growth and devotional bliss as these colonizers insisted? Do we really need a Spanish Inquisition just because someone's having a loving experience of union with God? Looking at the motives of the people who felt it necessary to really rigorously test this and throw people in jail for having mystical experiences, it seems their interests were not purely spiritual or humane. And so some self-examination might be healthy if we ourselves are feeling some kind of similar urge to control someone else's mystical experiences. I'm just throwing that out there so we kind of have a reality check. If you're feeling a little uncomfortable with the idea that some people may have mystical experiences in prayer, it might be helpful to look at what happens when we're really so worried about how someone else is praying. And who are the people historically who have really been worried about that, and why have they really been? Just throwing it out there. Might be self-check, self-examination, prayerful self-examination. We've tried it before. Always a good tool. I'll leave it at that. So still, when we have such an experience ourselves of mystical union, or feeling like I feel like I'm connecting with God, but is it really God? I used to experience that with students in an evangelical setting a lot. They would really worry that they were being self-delusional if they had too sweet an experience of prayer, which is, anyway, all right, I'm not going to judge that. So anyway, so some people have been taught to be very skeptical of their own prayer experiences for whatever reason, and that might be part of your journey. So if you're wondering if your prayer experience is real, as mentioned before, especially in the last chapter, I'm talking about contemplative prayer. When we experience this kind of intimate, loving union with God, and it changes us for the better in ways that last, even the skeptical inquisitors had to admit that something genuinely spiritual had happened. So that's really it. Again, I've said it before, but in the Bible, Jesus called it, the short phrase for this in the Christian tradition is the fruits test. Is it bearing fruit? Is that fruit good? Then it's probably not coming from human effort. It's probably coming from God. In fact, Jesus said definitely it's kind of, only a good tree bears good fruit. So one way to recognize true prayer of union is, as John of the Cross said, an almost continual sense of the presence of God, regardless of what's going on around us in daily life and our relationships. So it may not always feel good. And remember, this is John of the Cross who wrote about, experienced a dark night of the soul. He experienced intense depressions and pain. So did Teresa, his teacher. So it wasn't that this experience was always blissful, but they had felt like God was with them, even when they were being tried by the Inquisition, even when John was being beaten in prison. It didn't make the pain go away, emotional or physical, but he didn't feel alone entirely with it. He did believe and experience some kind of sense of presence with God. In fact, it was more intimate than that. I'm not going to gloss over it. Actually, back when I wrote this, I was in the closet. So I'm just going to come right out and say it now. If you read Dark Night of the Soul, if you know like Lorena McKennett's beautiful musical setting for that prayer, that poem prayer, he talks about Jesus in this beautiful, loving way, like Jesus is his lover. And he talks about being on the breast of his lover, Jesus. It's just gorgeous. It's just absolutely gorgeous. So the longing he had for Jesus is almost like an intimate physical longing, and it's a communion of prayer. These are not mutually exclusive. So that kind of lit his way through this very dark time while he was getting beaten and tortured and isolated in prison for his prayer life, for his very queer prayer life. Okay, so it's probably God if we don't feel totally alone, if we feel a sense of closeness to God. Another thing, we may experience a sense of being able to love other people, God, and ourselves with God's own love, way beyond what we know all too well to be our own usual limitations. So if I'm having a prayer experience and I don't know if it's from God or not, but I'm able to be more patient with people, more compassionate with people, more gentle with people, that's probably a sign I'm not making this up. Right? The experience of loving intimacy with God in this selfless kind of prayer always bears such fruits of the Spirit that others see and are blessed by it in an ongoing way. The whole character of this lover of God, this person who's experiencing mystical prayer, is progressively transformed, overflowing into continuously outpouring compassionate service. And that here I'm kind of drawing on Galatians 5, verses 22 to 23 for those that are looking for that. Again, that's Paul's teaching about what the fruits of the Spirit are, how they work themselves out in our outward behaviors and relationships. So if you see those things happening, it's a good indication that the prayer is genuine, right? It's really connecting with God and not with our own thoughts or ideas. In this deepest form of prayer, this loving intimacy with God, some experience being embraced by God so ecstatically and rapturously, with such passionate ardor and oneness, that they compare it to a kind of mystical marriage. Christian teachers of prayers warn us not to seek this union's sweetness as an end in itself. Why? You'd think, well, yeah, of course, chase after this loving union with God, right? That would be great. No, the caution is, and I've actually heard this from teachers of someone, I'll just say Krishna Das. Okay, I've heard it from Krishna Das. um, but other yogis too, like it's not just in the Christian tradition. In any tradition, it might be that chasing after this experience of feelings come and go. If you chase after it as an end in yourself, is very likely, in a sense, to be disappointed. So, what I wrote here is that the Christian teachers mentioned this gift is so rare to experience that moment of pure bliss with intimacy with God that's so complete that we lose ourselves in it. It's such a rare experience that more often we're going to experience not having that complete union with God. The more common experience of not blissing out in ecstasy causes some people to blame ourselves or God in bitter disappointment. Why didn't I have this loving experience with God? Why didn't I lose myself in rapture? And then we're focused on that instead of the loving, selfless, joyous service that can flow out of just kind of letting ourselves rest in God, letting habitual prayer or meditation change us and bear fruit in us over time. It's not that sudden one-time orgasmic explosion of, okay, that's it. Now I'm a saint. Now everything I do is going to be good. That's not really a realistic expectation of the spiritual life. So whether Christian teachers have warned us about that, and people of pretty much any tradition have warned us as well, not to set ourselves up for disappointment by expecting this kind of bliss all the time. Such intimate union is not really something we can force or earn. Those who've experienced it describe it as a gift that only God can give. What we can do is to cultivate the soil of our lives, to prepare, like we're gardeners, to prepare for this gift of loving intimacy as if our daily life is a garden. We prune out distractions and selfishness, nourishing an ongoing, quiet, loving attention to God by making prayer and meditation ongoing daily habits. That's how I live my life. I wrote that a long time ago, but that's how I live my life now. And in the pandemic, in the lockdown, even more so. It's easier to quietly tend a garden. And I'm breaking from the reading just for a minute to just say that does not mean that I don't have my highs and lows, because I do. And the ongoing steady work of sort of cultivating the soil, it's still good work to be doing. I just don't, again, I don't want to set up an unrealistic expectation. It definitely doesn't mean that I never, yeah, I get irritable, I get sad, I get frustrated, all those things happen. I mean, those things happen when you're gardening too. I don't know if you know, for those who've gardened, it doesn't mean it's all flowers and blossoms and fragrance and fruit all the time that's ripe, right? It's got its ups and downs. But it's keeping at it steadily, daily, consistent habits. So we can ready ourselves, our habits of thought and behavior, our time and attention, but we can't force the timing or intensity of when the rainfall of God's grace falls on us, melting away our sense of individual personhood into a perfect sense of union with all that is. That rainfall, that washing away, that happens when it happens. We can't really control that. As we await that rain of divine love, we may ready ourselves or practice by learning from those who've experienced such union in prayer. Other people's examples, for example, those that the Bible calls the friends of God. If you're looking for that phrase in the Bible, the friends of God are mentioned in Genesis 18, verses 17 to 22, Isaiah 41, verse 8, and James 2, verse 23. Okay, and those are just for those folks that would like that. So the next piece, I'm going to wrap up after this section, but the next piece I want to expand on that a little bit, praying with the great cloud of witnesses, or ancestors, elders, saints. The whole point is building on that last sentence, that last concept of what we're working toward is I'm going to guide us in a practice sometime this week of cultivating the soil, readying ourselves to possibly experience that prayer of union by praying with or following the example of people who have experienced that. What did they do? I want what they have. What did they do? How did they do? How did they get there? Right? And again, because those who may be the most uncomfortable with even having this conversation, let alone practicing this, may be in a Christian tradition that maybe they didn't get taught about this. I am going to again emphasize that I'm going to emphasize examples from the Christian scriptures, but also the Jewish scriptures. So just as we can't see the wind, ruach, or that Hebrew word that means God's spirit and wind and breath. So just like we can't see the wind, we can also look for evidence of the power of the wind to know that it's real and present. I can't see the wind itself, but I can see branches moving. I can see a tumbleweed rolling along, that's what we're talking about. So in the same sense, we can look for evidence of the spirit in people's lives. We can look for evidence of the prayer of union in the lives of people that have experienced that kind of intimacy with God. In the Christian Bible, the letter to the Hebrews is where I'm really going to lean in this section. It describes the importance of the example of the ancients. Now that's actually in there, the ancients. Okay, and of course that's a concept that's in many, many, many spiritual traditions around the world, not just biblical ones. So in the Hebrew scriptures, the ancients are those whose relationships with God are the role models for anyone who's trying to live in friendship and intimacy with God now. According to the writer of this letter to the Hebrews, okay, this is a quote very familiar to those in the Christian tradition. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And this is part that part gets quoted a lot. There's more to this letter. And such faith endures even when what God promises is never received in this life. Now, okay, what I just said and emphasized, that's my paraphrase of what I'm about to expand on. I will quote the passage, but my point is the letter of the Hebrews actually tells the stories and recounts many, many names of all these folks that they never saw what God promised them. They died before that happened. A real major point of the middle of the letter to the Hebrews is that faith doesn't mean you get what you prayed for. Faith doesn't even mean you get what God promised you. Faith means even when you don't see that, you still believe. You still have a sense that God's present with you, even though you see no evidence for that. This is very meaningful to me right now in these times, seeing what people I care about are going through all over this country, all over the world. So I share it with you, and I hope it's meaningful to someone else. But if not, I thank God that I had this moment to study these words. Even those who pray with the greatest loving intimacy may wander through this life like an exile. Faith and loving intimacy with God don't prevent suffering. Now, I know everybody knows that in a sense, but I'm saying this to people that believe in the Bible, and there are people who have been taught in the Christian tradition somehow. I don't know how you get this out of the Bible because it does not say this, but some folks seem to believe that if they do everything right, and if their faith is just so, they're going to get all the goodies, the health and the wealth, and God's going to bless them with material things in this world, in this life. And that is just not what it says. So I would ask you to read the letters. If you're Christian, and if you believe that, I would just really ask you to sit down with the letter to the Hebrews and read it for yourself. That's all I can ask. I know, because I know that's what convinces you is what you see in the scriptures. So read it in any translation. Doesn't matter. This is not one of those times I will explain why the King James translation is not a very good translation. In this case, it doesn't matter. Read the letter to the Hebrews any way you want to, in any language you want to, and see what you find. All right. So where it says faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. What's going on before that and what's going on after that is a story is being told, is that faith and loving intimacy with God don't prevent suffering. Faith and loving intimacy with God help us not to lose our belief that God desires something better for us, even though we're suffering. And for anyone who's struggling with that, you might want to look at Hebrews 11, especially verses 1, 13, and 16, but of course, read it in context. When we ourselves can't see the object of our faith and we're struggling to believe, like many traditions who take strength in the enduring presence and example of ancestors, the biblical writers too encourage us to look at others who've shared our struggle and yet still lived by faith anyway. When, not if, when we can't see God directly, we can see the power of God in the lives of those who love God. The letter to the Hebrews names Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Joseph, Moses, Rahab, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets collectively. And I do want to make note that 2 women are named there. Not that there wouldn't be more, but in the biblical tradition, women aren't always equally centered with men. And yet, even in this list in the Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, 2 women are named as examples of faith. One of them, a sex worker, Rahab. So, an example of faith for all to follow. Times hard. Definitely not. Just a life of struggle, right? And a model of faith lifted up. That this is a person who didn't realize all equality and justice and prosperity in her lifetime, and felt God's presence with her and shared that presence that she felt with other people in a way that has been passed down for millennia. Very powerful example of faith. So all those prophets that I just named, they're cited here as models of faith who never lived to see the promised land. So now I'm going to quote it. This is chapter 11, verses 35 through 40. This is the Bible. This is the New Revised Standard Version. No paraphrasing, no editing. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and scourging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering over deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though well attested by their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had foreseen something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. I know that's very depressing, but it acknowledges the reality of the lives of the faithful as when you're struggling, when you're suffering, when you're even suffering that much, you have not done something wrong. It doesn't mean your faith is weak. And certainly to judge someone else who's struggling and saying, oh, that's happening to them because their faith is weak, well, take a look at Hebrews here. Are you going to say that about the people that are being named here? Are you going to say that about Moses? I don't know why I'm taking this tone with whomever is watching this with me. I guess, I've been on the receiving end of some judgment myself, and I guess I feel some kind of way about that. So I apologize. I don't direct that at anybody that's watching this, and I'll just point those fingers back at myself. I get tempted to judge every single day, and I guess I just did it a few minutes ago. So, yeah. I don't judge people who are suffering like that, but I judge people who are judging. So there I go. Which is a form of suffering. It's like mental torment. Anyway, I digress. There's a very emotional passage for me. The things that people are going through right now. I just, I honor that people of faith are going through those struggles, and God is with them. And that, yeah. All right. I'm going to just quote a couple more verses from it, but I just want to pause for a moment, honor the struggles of those present and those past, and just share that one of the things that's very powerful about that passage is before the writer of the letter to the Hebrews points to Jesus as our example, that biblical writer points to these ordinary human examples first to encourage us to persevere in our own lives of prayer and worship. And this is what this writer then says. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. Remember that sin is just anything that's distracting us from the fullness of what God would have us be, right? Let us also lay aside. Okay, let me start again. Therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. This writer of this letter to the Hebrews then encourages Jewish followers of Jesus. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but at the time there was no such thing as Christians. The people who followed Jesus initially were Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. They prayed at the temple until the temple was destroyed in 70 when the Romans destroyed it. Okay, if you don't know. Anyway, okay, what am I saying? All right, so there's a lot of different forms of prejudice. I'm feeling some kind of way tonight. I'm feeling a lot of ways about human prejudices tonight. Wow, it's really, yeah, that's something that distracts me from faith, and that I feel some, how can I say? It's one of those struggles in this life right now that sometimes separates me from religious community, or I don't want to say it causes me to have doubt in God. It's not exactly that, but it's a struggle. I feel like I'm gonna have to figure out how to integrate that into this writing, but it seems like it's very much relevant. So even that passage I just read, I'm thinking this is a huge stumbling block. It's talking about Jesus and the cross, and some people are gonna not be able to feel like they could be connected with that particular reading at all. And I didn't have that in here, but I wanted to share that I think one of the pieces of that message at the end is that Jesus has this faith. Jesus still ends up on a cross, and Jesus doesn't take on the shame. Where it says despising the shame, Jesus doesn't take on the shame from the humiliation that was heaped on him, for example, by the Roman soldiers, or by those who were very mocking toward him. We're going to talk about the Stations of the Cross. That's one of the things I talk about before we wrap up this whole book. So I'll talk about that and unpack that. It's a very powerful set of metaphors and examples that Jesus doesn't internalize the shame of other people bullying him, harassing him, even doing violence to him. He doesn't accept responsibility for their violence. At no point does he say, I deserve this, or this is my lot in life. Oh, well, he endures it. That's an example. And he keeps praying. He accepts help from other people. And at no point does he blame himself. I know I'm going to unpack that a lot later, but it felt like it was really important to say that as we're looking at this letter to the Hebrew, even though I'm almost done with this section of reading. All right. The writer of this letter to the Hebrew then encourages Jewish followers of Jesus to strive for peace with all people and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. So it doesn't matter how much faith you have. My point in bringing this one up was right after saying that about the great cloud of witnesses, this writer says it doesn't matter, in a sense, how much faith you have on the inside of you. If you don't live that out, if you don't have peace with all people, not just the people who believe the same way you do, if you don't have peace with all people and live a life that shows people God's love, then you're what are you doing? In the first 4 centuries of world Christianity, the idea of emulating earlier people of faith was just as important as reading the Bible. And again, I'm directing this to people that think reading the Bible is the only thing they need to do. And especially if those who might read the Bible in such a way as to just point out everyone else's faults, shortcomings, or why certain of us are excluded from religious communities or whatever it might be. Just to know that that's a really new way of interpreting Christian spirituality, and that it, again, in the first 4 centuries, the time closest to Jesus, the idea was, as African monk and theologian Athanasius of Alexandria, who was one of the fathers of the church. I don't know. Yeah, there we go. As he taught, we always have to live the Bible in order to really understand it. And that requires imitating those who believed before us, whether they're those who are teaching us today, still alive, or those that we're reading about in our sacred texts. Athanasius said, read the scriptures intelligently, with the Spirit as your guide, while striving to imitate the lives of those God-bearing saints who spoke them at first. Saints here in the original means believers, or the blessed, I'm sorry. Hold on, let me just go ahead and add that. I took this part out. I had a long section on saints I took out because I was like, that's just going to be too big of a stumbling block for people. But I will say that the saints just means the blessed, the people that have it's not what it came to mean later. It just meant people living faithful lives who are good examples for us. Now, here and now, it could be people who are still living right now, people we know. So building on our earlier practice of prayerful self-examination, we can look beyond ourselves to pray and live the teachings of our elders, ancestors, and heroes of faith, whatever our tradition. We can learn from the examples of those who came before us, those who clearly shared loving intimacy with God, a godly life, an example we hope to follow. Even the study of the Bible, a practice which all Christians today around the world agree is central to their Christian faith, has always been tied globally and historically to practicing a life of prayer and imitation of those about whom we read, those whose very prayers we pray in the book of Psalms, in the Gospels, and elsewhere in scriptures. So my point is, prayer is not just talking the talk of those who prayed before us, it's also walking the walk. And so tomorrow, the section we'll get to is a little bit more about praying with those who came before us, and specifically what were they praying for? What was it like for them when they experienced union with God? What kind of union with God were they seeking to experience? So I'll just talk about a little bit about those who experienced bliss or beatitude, blessedness in the presence of God. So thank you for being with me tonight. I don't know, I was a little bit all over the place today, but thanks for your patience. We'll try again tomorrow.